As many of you who have watched more than a handful of my videos know, I am a Christian. But I also like logic, reasoning, and rationality. On the surface, this appears to be a huge contradiction, especially for the atheists out there. After all, if there's one thing that's been consistent since the rise of new atheism, it's that theists in general, and Christians in particular, just are illogical and irrational. You don't have to look further than Richard Dawkins' book title, The God Delusion, to see that. It doesn't surprise me in the least that atheists do this. Indeed, one could even make the claim that atheism makes these claims in particular against Christianity because the Bible in multiple places says, "The fool says in his heart there is no God." But here's the thing. I actually don't think that atheists have a way to ground logic in any meaningful sense, such that calling someone irrational under their worldview would even matter. Instead, where logic matters is when it's grounded in a theistic worldview. So an atheist literally has to steal capital from theism in order to then assert that theism is irrational. Now I know those are fairly big claims there, so let me not beat around the bush. I'm just going to state directly what I'm trying to do here with this video, and you can watch and see when it's done if I've accomplished my aims. So what this video will seek to do is first to show that any definition of logic that can actually assert that theism is irrational is so philosophically weak that it doesn't matter if a view is irrational in that sense. Secondly, I hope to show that any definition of logic that is strong enough for it to matter that a view is irrational under that system of logic must presuppose the existence of a ground to logic that contains the attributes of a classical definition of God. Furthermore, I will state up front that this argument does not prove that Christianity is correct. Whether or not the Christian God is the correct God would be a different subject, although I will address one brief point on that at the very end. So first, if we are going to be dealing with logic, it's probably useful to ask, what is logic? This seemingly simple question becomes tricky because many people have a flawed view of logic in the first place. In fact, one of the first things that I'll stress is important precisely because so many people tend to forget it, even though we would all agree, and that is, logic isn't a thing. It doesn't exist in physical space somewhere. It's not an object that we can hold in our hands. This is a problem because philosophers and really thinkers of all kinds often reify logic. To reify something is to treat an abstract concept as if it exists physically. Think of Mother Nature as the reification of weather, for example. In any case, philosophers often reify logic and treat it as if it exists as an actual entity. But that isn't logic, and treating logic as if it has some sort of existence out there, somewhere, is going to lead to all sorts of problems. Logic is instead something mental, that is, it exists such as it does, as an immaterial concept in minds. Logic, in fact, is better thought of as the way that humans think about things. Indeed, there is a view of logic that goes so far as to say that that is all that logic is. Logic is nothing more or less than the linguistic interplay of words and labels following the rules of grammar in sentences. You make propositions out of words and then look at whether or not they relate in a valid manner to other propositions and sort things accordingly. Under this view of logic, the only things that could be logical are things that can be expressed verbally. Logic doesn't govern anything outside of the mind, so events that happen in the real world are not logical in and of themselves. They are instead talked about, and only that which is expressed verbally can be logical or illogical. At best, the conclusions of this logic will only give us a subjective truth, since all conclusions are found solely in the mind, and such logic will not extend into objective reality. The problem is that if we are going to argue that the existence of God is irrational, then we are merely arguing about whether or not such a concept follows mental rules devised by human beings, not whether or not a being such as God actually does exist. Thus, under that definition of logic, it wouldn't really matter if something is logical or illogical, since such determination has no bearing on whether or not something exists, but only on whether or not a linguistic token that is supposed to represent such a thing happens to follow the rules we defined as logic. Now, most people find that view of logic to be very unsatisfactory. Indeed, it seems to go against science itself. Just take another concept such as quantum mechanics, which literally ascribes certain things that seem to be irrational, such as light being both a particle and a wave simultaneously, or an electron existing in a superposition before it is measured. And yet these prima facie irrational concepts are not treated with disdain by atheists. What's the difference? Well, let's go to a second view of logic. It will remove logic from being a verbal construct existing solely in the mind, and instead treats logic as the fundamental ordering of reality itself. And it is this view of logic that most people hold to. It is fundamental to how science is conducted. After all, in order to prove something, we need to be able to repeat our experiments. And the understanding is that if every single variable is exactly the same the second time we run an experiment, then the result will be exactly the same as it was the first time we ran it. Thus, we expect that reality will follow the rules of logic. If P, then Q. But in reality, we are actually deriving if P, then Q from the fact that every observation of reality has resulted in the same result every time we have the same input. So if we do the experiment exactly the same and we get the exact same results, something is fundamental about reality that is driving that. So it is because we have observed quantum behavior that we conclude, even if it seems at first to be irrational, that light does in fact behave both as a particle and a wave simultaneously, and electrons can be in superpositions that become a defined point when measured. So this second view of logic, that it is something that rises out of our observations of reality and not something that is just thought about, is a much stronger form of logic. I think it's trivially easy to see that if something is irrational under that first view, it doesn't really mean a whole lot. Who cares if something doesn't match the rules of language? People can speak in paradoxes and they can outright lie all the time. Language isn't an arbiter of truth. But in the second view, if reality itself is instructing us what the laws of logic are, then if something is irrational, it means that it conflicts with reality. And reality is real. It won't change just because you hope it will be otherwise. Everyone knows this instinctively. It's why even someone who claims to believe that everything is an illusion still looks both ways before they cross the street. So let us take this stricter view of logic and ask a simple, yet I believe very profound question. What must be true of reality for this view of logic to be correct? That is to say, if we are deriving our laws of logic from reality itself, then what must the nature of reality be for us to get those laws out of reality? Let's just start simply. The law of non-contradiction says that something can't be both something and not something at the same time and with the same respect. For example, it cannot be true that I am both 6 foot 1 inch in height and at the same time be not true that I am 6 foot 1 inch in height. What this implies is that reality must be such that I cannot be in reality both 6 foot 1 inch and not 6 foot 1 inch at the same time and in the same manner. Reality itself will not permit a contradiction to exist. But what is the implication when we say that reality will not permit a contradiction? Is this something that is true only here, or is it true everywhere? Perhaps the laws of logic don't work outside of our galaxy. Perhaps on the opposite side of Alpha Centauri there is a planet where something can both be itself and its contradiction. Now let us suppose that there is a place where reality can exist with contradictions. That would mean that here on Earth it is irrational to hold to contradictions, but there, in that hypothetical place, it is not irrational to hold to contradictions. So we have a choice. Either logic exists in such a manner where location determines whether a law of logic is irrational or not, or logic exists the same everywhere. If it is the first example, then who cares if anything is considered irrational under that view? Certainly the fact that something is irrational on Earth would not mean it's irrational anywhere else. So what difference does it make if something is irrational here? This is what I meant when I said that if logic is defined sufficiently weakly, then it doesn't matter what is or isn't irrational. Because if you can hold to contradictions being valid somewhere else, then how could saying the belief in God is irrational be any kind of detriment to the believer? So no, we clearly have to assert that logic is not just valid here, but it must be in fact valid everywhere for it to matter. If there are any place where logic doesn't apply, then to be irrational is no obstacle to anything. But if logic does apply everywhere, then to be irrational is a death blow to a view. But remember, we are arguing that logic arises out of reality here. It's not our thinking imposing this on reality, it is the observation of reality that is imposing on our thinking. Thus, in order for logic to be valid, then whatever it is that permits us to observe logic arise out of reality must itself be everywhere in the universe. And it is easily seen that, for the same reason, logic must be valid in all of time. If there was ever a time when the law of non-contradiction did not apply, then it doesn't matter if a view is irrational, since we've established that reality permits irrationality at certain times. So whatever it is about reality that causes logic to be observed, if logic is to matter, it must be found in every location, no matter when or where you go. Now, what is the term for something that is found in every location, no matter where you go? Omnipresence. And what do you call something that is found in every time, no matter when you go? Eternality. And let us be precise here. When we are talking about omnipresence, we're not talking just about things that exist materially. Nor, when we're talking about eternality, are we speaking only of the existence of space-time. For we have observed that distant galaxies are receding from us very rapidly, and as a result are left with the inevitable conclusion that the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang. And if someone is tempted to say that the laws of logic only apply to the universe after it came into existence, after the Big Bang, then we are saying that before the Big Bang, the irrational is permitted to exist without any problems. There was no logic before then, so how can irrationality be bad? Again, this would render the atheist argument that theism is irrational completely toothless. If the irrational is permitted before the existence of the universe, then why is it suddenly precluded because of the existence of the universe? So no, atheists cannot assert that theism is irrational in a meaningful sense unless logic pre-exists the physical universe, which means that whatever it is that grounds logic has to exist before the material world existed. Thus, the grounding of logic is not only omnipresent and eternal, it is also immaterial. Now think of this. We are asserting that the grounding of logic is omnipresent, eternal, and immaterial so far. What else can we say? Well, clearly, whatever it is that grounds logic must actually exist. For if it doesn't exist, it can't be used to ground logic. So ironically enough, for all the materialists out there, if you assert that it matters that theism is irrational, then you're arguing for the existence of something immaterial. Not only does the immaterial exist, but the form of existence must be a necessary type of existence. That is, it can't not exist. Because if it ever ceased to exist, then the laws of logic would cease to exist as well. And if the laws of logic can cease to exist without any problem, then clearly being irrational doesn't matter. What do we call something that exists necessarily? We call that self-existence. It does not rely on anything else existing in order for it to exist. Thus, we are saying whatever exists to ground logic is self-existent. Now, if you were to ask a theist what is a bare bones definition of God, they would say God is a being that is eternal, immaterial, self-existent, and omnipresent. All of which are the attributes that spring out of our investigation of what must be true in order for us to hold to a high enough view of logic so that being irrational actually has teeth to it. So atheists, you have a choice here. You can either accept that logic itself presupposes a self-existent, omnipresent, eternal, and immaterial something. Not only is that possible, but it is necessary, or you can jettison logic and not care about being irrational. Again, at this point, you don't have to agree with Christianity, but you certainly would be a rather strange atheist if you argued that such an entity did exist but wasn't a god of some kind. And on that point, I do want to address one thing about Christianity in particular. Like I've stressed repeatedly, the above argument would not be sufficient to prove Christianity is the right form of theism. But here's something to consider. The word logic comes from the Greek word logos. And in the Gospel of John, John begins by writing, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, I personally disagree with having the interpretation there of word, because the actual word being used by John is the Greek word logos. I think we should not translate the term because it means far more than just word. Instead, we should view that verse as, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God." John teaches a correlation between Logos and God. And in verse 3, John says, "Of the Logos, all things were made through him, and without him, not anything was made that was made." John later tells us in verse 18 that the Logos is none other than Jesus Christ himself, and the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. So while this argument doesn't prove Christianity, Christianity clearly links Christ to logic itself, and clearly says that all things were made through that logic, Christ. It should be no surprise then that if we look at what must be true in order for logic to matter, we see that the very attributes of the one who is both with God and God himself come too.